Hey guys, this is WW2 Scaled, and in today's video we'll be covering the painting and weathering of this Miniart Mk.III Valentine in 1/35th scale. The first thing I do on the kit is put a good coat of primer. The primer always helps me spot any imperfections that are on the surface, and it also helps protect the metal parts and prevent the paint from scratching off of them. Here I'm painting the base coat using XF62 Olive Drab, but as you can see underneath there's a sand color, and that's because I was originally going to do the paint job that's on the box art at the beginning of the video. I wasn't able to do this because while I was cleaning my airbrush I damaged the Teflon seal, so the airbrush wasn't spraying very well. It was spraying good enough to do a single color camouflage, so I decided to do this instead. After painting the model, I sent the airbrush in to Badger warranty and they got it fixed within a couple of weeks. The airbrush now is working good as new, so all is okay. Here I'm painting the tracks with a mix of black and Japanese Ground Defense Force brown because I feel it produces a really nice track color and a good basis for weathering. After that I go to painting smaller details like the road wheels, and the rubber on the road wheels I always brush paint those with XF85 rubber black, and I feel that the brush painting turns out really good and is in fact easier than just creating a template and airbrushing it. The rubber black also produces a much more realistic finish than using a standard black color for the rubber texture on the road wheels. After applying a gloss coat on the model, I'm putting down all the decals and markings on the kit. Before I apply all the decals, I like to put a coat of Microset onto the surface where I'm going to be applying the decal. Microset helps me move around the decal and position it before it starts sticking to the surface. After I have the decal in the position that I like, I put down the Microsol, which is the red bottle, and Microsol helps the decal conform to all the textures that are on the model. While I wait for the decal solutions to dry, I go and paint all the details on the model. Here I'm using Tamiya wooden decktan to paint the wooden handles of all the tools. After that, I use Tamiya rubber black to paint all the metal surfaces of the tools. This will be weathered to a metallic finish later on. I like to use raw sienna oil paint to add the wooden grain texture on all the wooden handles of the tools. After this, I'm using Mk.III, which is a two-part epoxy to create some stowage for the tank. Here I'm creating a tarp which I rolled out using a toothpick, and then I roll it with my fingers onto the model and let it dry in place. I then use a toothpick to add creases to the tarp and little wrinkles near the edges. I then create a smaller bedroll and add in the rear stowage bin of the turret. It is detailed the same way as before, using a toothpick to add creases and wrinkles on the edge of the tarp. Here I'm painting both the bedroll and tarp with Model Master Railroad Tie Brown. This is actually a color for model railroading, but I thought it was good for this purpose and was a really nice color for stowage. Here I'm using Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown oil paint to create some color variation on the tarp and the bedroll. Now to some of the real weathering. So here I use WW2 buff oil paint. I thin it heavily and apply it to the edges of the lower hull. I then blend it in using a flat brush, and this helps me create some dust accumulation on the underside of the tank. Here I'm using Vallejo engine grime to add some oil leaks and grime accumulation on the inside of the road wheel where all the bolts are. Now I'm using MiG's dark brown for green vehicles enamel wash. I apply this wash to most of the extruding details, and then later brush off the excess with a flat brush that has been dipped in MiG enamel thinner. This helps get rid of the excess wash as well as create a small streaking effect. I create a chipping color using the base color and lighten it with some white. I then apply it to areas where the crew would walk over a lot, areas such as the edge of hatches, some handles, or the sharp edges of the tank. I apply this using a sponge and hold it with some tweezers. After letting the washes of the lower and upper hull dry, as well as the chipping, I begin things like oil weathering and pigment application. Here I'm adding some streaking grime on the side using some WW2 oil paint. I apply it in small dots along the hinges, and then use a flat brush dipped in oil thinner to streak it downwards. On the sides of the tank, I use some sand color oil paints to create some dust that would be splashed up by the tracks. Here I'm using WW2 buff and also Winsor & Newton Naples yellow. After applying all the dots of oil paint, I use a flat brush dipped in oil thinner to streak them downwards. If I want to emphasize the effect a little bit more, I can always go back in with the small brush and add some more oil paint and then streak it down again. Here, I want to create a still layer of dust that has accumulated on the flat layer of the tank. To do this, I apply some sand color oil paints on the edges of the flat part, but then, instead of streaking the paint, I only stipple it with the paintbrush. This brush is still dipped in thinner, but by stippling it, it creates less of a streaking effect and more of a still layer of dust. I do this instead of pigments because sometimes pigments can be a little bit too thick and noticeable, and the oil paints blend more a little bit with the streaking effects that are on the side of the tank. After letting the buff oil wash of the lower hull dry, I begin my pigment application. Here I use MiG Splash's Dry Step, which is a medium density mud effect. It's in between the consistency of paint and then an actual mud effect. So I apply this product to the areas where I'll have the heaviest amount of pigment, and it helps create an undercolor that'll make it different from the areas with light pigment application, where the green base coat of olive drab will be able to be seen. Here I'm applying wilder pigments on these heavier areas first, and then I'll later blend it in with the brush and smoothen it out into the open areas in the center. So here I'm using the wilder dry European mud pigment, which is the darker pigment I'm using, and I apply this one first over the areas of heavier pigment concentration, and then after I come in with the light pigment and blend it in. So here I'm using the road clay pigment, which is the lighter pigment, to blend it into the center areas which have less mud accumulation. So I just use the flat brush again and then stipple it right in the center there and help blend it in. When everything's in place, I use pigment fixer and just use an eyedropper to drop it in place. This helps secure the pigment so it doesn't come off later on, and then lets me do some other oil weathering on top of it without damaging the pigments. After the fixer has completely dried, I use Wilder Grey Dirt Spatter to add some dust spatter along the edges of the idler wheel area and the drive sprocket area. And I just do this by putting it on a tweezer and flicking it down with a brush, and it just creates some little droplets of wet mud or differently colored mud that splashes up along the edges of the lower hull. After this is dried, I come in with some oil paints and just add some darker streaking on the lower parts of the lower hull. I use, again, Abteilung oil paints and then apply it with a fine brush and then usually streak it down. Except that this time I streak it down with a dry brush rather than one with thinner because I don't want to affect the pigments that are already set in place. I also use the same oil paints to create some grime and oil leak effects near the bolts which are found along the lower hull. Here, I'm using the same European road clay pigment as I used earlier, and I'm using it to create some dust accumulation on the front, rear, and fenders of the tank. The dust pigment is stippled on and then blended in with a flat brush to make the effect less harsh. Here, I'm using the European road clay pigment. This is the same pigment I used for the weathering of the sides of the lower chassis. The pigment is stippled on and then fixed in place using the Wilder fixer. After letting the fixer dry, I used dark road clay effect to add some wet sections of dirt randomly along the track. I saw this technique being used in another video and I like how it turned out, so I decided to try it out myself. Some of the last touches I do to the model are to weather the tools and stowage that are on it. Here I'm using AK dark scaled pigment to add a metallic finish to the metal surfaces of the tool. I apply the pigment on a Q-tip and then scrub it onto all the metal surfaces. This helps give a metallic finish which is not too shiny and looks realistic. Finally, I'm applying some dust pigments onto the stowage tarp at the back of the tank. This was mostly done in an effort to try and remove the glossy finish that was left behind by the oil paint I applied earlier. Here is the completed model. Despite some fit issues in the early part of the build, this was a nice kit to get to try out some of the new Wilder weathering pigments that I got. I got to experiment with new techniques and get some new experience. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one, where I build Tamiya's 1/35 scale IS-2 from start to finish.